It was late October of 1993, and John Matthews of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina had just scored a date with Sarah, one of the most popular girls in school, and he had planned the perfect night out for the two of them. A haunted house had just been set up in town, and he, like many guys before him, figured he could use that as a chance to impress his date. He'd already been through the attraction, so he knew exactly when to put his arm around Sarah when one of the costume actors or animatronics tried to spook them. If any of them got too close for comfort, he might even punch them, just to show Sarah how brave he was. That would be a surefire way to impress any girl. However, John had no idea of the real horror that waited for him and his date through the doors of this seemingly normal funhouse. At first, the haunted house went as normal. John laughed at all the fake cobwebs and plastic skeletons, making sure Sarah knew how dumb he thought they looked. He shoved away actors dressed as axe murderers and told them to stay away from his date. It was dark, so they couldn't really see each other's faces, but John guessed that Sarah was probably really impressed. All in all, the date was going well, until they got to a room that John hadn't seen the first time he'd been through. It seemed like it had been added overnight, but at the same time it didn't mesh with the theme. The theme of the haunted house this year was Cannibal Hotel, but this room looked more like Dracula's castle, complete with actors dressed as Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and Dracula himself. One of them was even a dead ringer for the actor Vincent Price. John and Sarah watched, confused, as the actors performed their routines which, just like their surroundings, seemed out of place. It was total hackneyed, full of lame puns and very basic scares, though the special effects were undeniably impressive. When John and Sarah walked through the room, the actor dressed as Dracula stood in front of John and started pretending to hypnotize him. Up close, he did look a lot like Bela Lugosi, the actor who'd portrayed the Count during his first big screen appearance. This definitely threw John off a little, but unfortunately, this Dracula didn't have Lugosi's acting talents. "You are under my control," Dracula said, waving his fingers at John and staring at him. John, getting really sick of this, pushed the guy out of the way to move on to the next room. But when he did, he felt that something was really wrong here. He practically dragged Sarah away from watching the Wolfman transform and ran the rest of the way through the house, all of his bravado now gone. Sarah asked her date what was wrong, and he didn't tell her. How could he without sounding crazy? When he had touched that actor playing Dracula, something hadn't felt right. Even through his suit and cape, John had been able to tell that something was wrong. He was cold and rigid, not like a human being, but like a robot or a wax dummy. This is just one of multiple complaints from Halloween attractions around the United States that prompted the action of the SCP Foundation. Several witnesses described either seeing people that resembled classic movie monsters or living wax models of those monsters appearing in various haunted houses, corn mazes, carnivals, and strip malls across the country. The Foundation has designated this troupe of hammy wax actors SCP-4153. During performances, SCP-4153 use wax to alter their appearance, produce props, including fake blood and gore, and even manipulate wax objects from afar. While this results in some uncanny special effects, the content of the performances tend to be pretty standard classic haunted house fare. They mostly do things like reenacting scenes from classic horror films and telling spooky jokes, with a little fake blood here and there. When the Foundation arrived at the Myrtle Beach attraction, they apprehended the various wax characters and determined that their eerie resemblance to the classic horror characters wasn't just makeup. After the horror some of these Foundation employees had seen on the job, living wax models of Frankenstein's monster and Dracula seemed almost cute in comparison, and the troupe of wax actors were taken to Site 9 for questioning and containment. The first member of the troupe to be interviewed on site was Dracula, dubbed SCP-4153-017 by the Foundation. He was interviewed by Agent Timothy West, who was totally unimpressed with Dracula's shtick. He tried to hypnotize Agent West, an act which he flatly refused to indulge in. Dracula provided the agent with seemingly no useful information, only responding to questions with cliches like, "We were all dead the whole time," and "The log was coming from inside the house." The next wax figure to be interrogated was Frankenstein's monster, aka SCP-4153-015, who was interviewed by Agent Samantha Henwick. Much like how SCP-4153-017 stayed fully in character as Dracula during his interview, SCP-4153-015 seemed to really believe that he was actor Boris Karloff, who played Frankenstein's monster in the 1930s. The SCP spoke in an exact imitation of Karloff's voice and speech patterns, and talked to Agent Henwick as if she was another actor on a movie set. He talked about how honored he was to be part of the project, and asked, "Are we rolling?" when he noticed the conversation was being recorded. Agent Henwick responded to the SCP's comments with confusion, a fact which he took to mean that she was staying in character. Like a true actor, he took a moment to prepare himself before pulling his own head off, much to the horror of Agent Henwick. The last and probably most interesting of the interviews conducted in 1993 was with the wax figure who resembled Vincent Price. More specifically, Vincent Price in his role as Henry Jared in 1953's House of Wax, a movie about a mad sculptor who made wax figures out of the corpses of his victims. This wax figure was designated SCP-4153-036 and was interviewed by Agent Gerald Penn. Penn started the interview with a simple question: why do you try to frighten people? SCP-4153-036 had an equally simple answer. Why does anyone try to frighten? It's fun to be frightened, almost as much fun as it is to do the frightening. Penn was skeptical, pointing out that the wax figure's act wasn't especially frightening. The SCP laughed dismissively, telling Penn to have some respect for the classics. Penn was still not having any of it. He had been with the SCP Foundation for 20 years at this point, and he'd seen enough real horror that the so-called classics had no effect on him whatsoever. He pressured Price for answers, but instead of responding with a straight answer, Price launched into a speech about his feelings on monsters. He said, "You'll call any oaf with a steak knife hunting gaggles of teens a monster these days. There's no wit, no humor, no charm. Where's the passion, the artisanship? Where's the sense of theater? Would you like to know something peculiar? I've almost never played a monster. Oh, I've played villains, most certainly, but not monsters. Only men besieged by fate, driven to revenge. Still, I've always had a fondness for them. Even as a child, I sympathized more with the monster than the hero." Agent Penn, who, at this point, was really getting tired of all the theatrics, started to interject. But when he opened his mouth to speak, he was only able to get a few words out before his tongue went numb and rigid in his mouth. He could no longer move it. Agent Penn tried to speak, but his tongue was too solid and heavy to do anything more than knock uselessly against his bottom teeth. He felt something dislodge inside his mouth, and he hoped maybe it was the feeling of his tongue being freed from whatever spell the SCP had put it under. But then he started to feel a tearing and a sticky heaviness in his bottom jaw. Agent Penn reached up and felt around inside his mouth. He started to scream indistinctly when he realized to his horror that his tongue had ripped off. He pulled it out of his mouth, and when he held it in his hand, his fears were confirmed. Somehow it had become nothing more than a lump of pink wax. Now completely tongueless, Agent Penn continued to babble frantically, no doubt trying to curse at the wax creature sitting in front of him. SCP-4153-036 finally paid attention to his interviewer's distress at this point. He turned to Agent Penn with a look of disapproval and disappointment and said, "Oh dear, your tongue seems to have gotten away from you there. Here, allow me." The SCP leaned towards Agent Penn, and though the agent wanted to resist, he found that he could no longer move his arms. In fact, his whole body had gone numb and rigid, just like the wax tongue. The only movement he was capable of was opening his mouth, and the wax facsimile of Vincent Price started molding his tongue back to the proper shape, and reattached it inside Agent Penn's mouth. Agent Penn whimpered, unable to do anything while the SCP's hands were in his mouth. The creature said, "Hush now, I warned you about this. I told you that you mustn't disturb the wax before it hardens. That is a crucial part of the process. It needs to solidify. Otherwise, you risk disturbing the performance." By the time his tongue was reattached and resealed, Agent Penn was on the verge of tears. He gurgled, gasping for air, wiggling his tongue around in his mouth to make sure that it worked. The SCP returned to his seat, pleased with his own handiwork. "Splendid, splendid, good as new. Now, let's take it from the top, shall we?" Agent Penn took a deep breath. Steadying himself as SCP-4153-036 whispered the word, "Action." Penn resumed the interview with the same simple question. Why do you try to frighten people? SCP-4153-036 gave the same simple answer. Why does anyone try to frighten? It's fun to be frightened. Almost as much fun as it is to do the frightening. The interview continued for only a few minutes longer, with both parties repeating only things they'd said earlier in the recording. The log ends with SCP-4153-036 once again saying, "Have some respect for the classics." Not long after the interview concluded, Foundation management completely lost contact with Site-9. A mobile task force was sent in to investigate the cause of this loss of contact, and on arrival, they found a catastrophic containment breach. Not a single member of on-site personnel was found alive, and strangely, all of their bodies seemed to be coated in wax. Further examination revealed that this initial observation wasn't the case at all. They weren't just coated in wax. No. Every member of the Site-9 team had all of their major organs, including their skin, surgically extracted and replaced with sculpted wax. Of course, this was assumed to be the doing of SCP-4153, but oddly, all of the autopsies suggested that the removal of organs had happened weeks before the apprehension of SCP-4153, even though all of the on-site personnel had seemed alive and well right up until the containment breach. Outside of being replaced by wax, no damage was done to the bodies. It seemed that everyone had just dropped dead at the same time. There was one body that was different though, that of Agent Gerald Penn. Agent Penn's decapitated body was found in the same containment cell that had been used for SCP-4153-036. Next to the body was a photograph showing SCP-4153-036 holding up Agent Penn's screaming head, and on the back, a single sentence was written. From one horror aficionado to another, always stay ahead. All of the SCP-4153 instances remain unaccounted for, and MTF Iota-10, also known as the Damn Feds, continue to monitor for new sightings and reports of activity that may be linked to the Wax Troop. Hopefully one day, they'll be taken into Foundation custody and contained, and maybe all it will take is for them to meet someone with a sufficient appreciation for the classics. Now for something from the more terrifying archives of the SCP Foundation, check out SCP-096, the Shy Guy, or SCP-106, the Old Man.